Peace be with you. This is the homily for the 29th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Suffering offers God's love in abundance. My dear brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, suffering is painful. And we all of us know it is an unpleasant experience that we experience in our daily lives. This suffering can come from oneself and as well as from others. This suffering is personal, communal, social, familial, physical, mental, emotional, and psychological. But be for sure that everyone experiences suffering in the world, and nobody can deny the fact. But suffering is not life alone. It's just a part of life. Suffering is not the path of life alone. It's a part of life. It is not so easy and it's not so difficult as well. But it all depends how we handle and how we understand this aspect of suffering. When we analyze and understand that suffering is part of life, we will have a different picture altogether about life that we live. That's what we read in the book of Job, chapter 2, verses 9 to 10. The wife of Job tells him, "Do you still retain your integrity? Curse God and die." A meaningful reply is given to his wife. Job says, "You speak like a foolish woman. When do you expect from God to give you happiness? Must you not accept sorrow as well?" Yes, my dear brothers and sisters. When we accept the suffering as a part of life, we will have a different approach altogether towards life. And today's liturgy of the word helps us to understand suffering in a better way, a new approach towards suffering in our understanding and in our living out the way of life that God has given. Therefore, today I would like to share with you 3 points as a reflection. The first point, suffering is a way to accomplish God's will. We all know that God has a plan for everyone, and no one can go away from God's plan because God has already planned for us what we should do and what we should not do. And sometimes God accomplishes His will in and through suffering. That's what we find in the first reading. We have the Song of the Suffering Servant, wherein we read in the first reading that it is the will of God that the suffering servant be crushed. And it is God who puts him into grief. And this suffering servant is accounted to be righteous for the sake of many to rise in life. Therefore, he has to bear upon himself the iniquities and the infirmities of people. So therefore, we find it is the will of God that the suffering servant should suffer to make us all rise in life. God's ways are mysterious. God's ways are definitely a way of grace and blessings. God can accomplish His plan, His will, even by way of suffering. But at times we understand this suffering is not a part of life. When we do not understand that this suffering is part of life, then we will get into the negativities around the world. Then we will deviate our focus from being the children of God. So let's pray that we accept that suffering is one of the ways in accomplishing God's will. The second point, suffering is a way to solidarity. My dear brothers and sisters, we have lots of associations. Our association does not remain only in times of happiness. At times, in times of sorrows, we associate with the other, wherein we show our solidarity. Solidarity in sorrow is also another way of accepting God's plan in our lives. And God has found or established this solidarity with His creatures, with us, in and through Jesus Christ. And that's what we read in the second reading. That God, although sent His only Son, that Jesus Christ is the high priest, was able to sympathize Himself in our weaknesses, in every way except in sin. But what is the difference between Jesus and us? Jesus was God. Jesus was strong. But for our sake, He made Himself a human being. For our sake, He made Himself weak, except in sin. And that shows that God wanted to unite ourselves in and through Jesus Christ. Therefore, this solidarity is also, or this suffering is another way of understanding or finding solidarity with our brothers and sisters. Sometimes we make ourselves weak for the sake of the other. Sometimes we make ourselves vulnerable for the sake of others' miserable conditions. Sometimes we suffer in order to offer life for someone. And it is for unity and solidarity. Let's pray that we understand that this suffering as a means and ways to unite or find solidarity with God and with one another. The third point, suffering is a way to lift up the other. My dear friends, suffering can also be a source of upliftment, encouragement, and inspiration to someone. And that's what we have it in the Gospel reading. We have in the Gospel reading the sons of Zebedee, James and John, come forward to Jesus asking for the seeds. And Jesus very plainly asked them, "Can you drink the cup of suffering that I'm about to drink?" And they say yes. Indeed, they were willing to suffer for Christ's sake. But we see in the middle of the gospel that the other disciples became indignant or jealous about these two brothers. And it is there Jesus teaches them, sometimes you need to suffer in order to lift up the other. Therefore, Jesus presents to us today certain change of wish list. I'm sure we all of us have this list of wishes that I want to become something, that I want to be something. And today Jesus says, you need to shift or change this wish list. The first wish list that Jesus gives to us today is power and authority. Everybody would like to have power and authority, but Jesus says, it shall not be among you. The rulers of the world lord it over the people, but it shall not be among you. Use this power and authority to serve people with love, with compassion, with mercy. And the second wish list that Jesus gives to us is greatness. Today, who does not want to be great in the world? Everybody wants to be recognized as great in the world. Therefore, lots of competition, lots of problems, conflicts among us. And Jesus says, be a servant than being great. And the third wish list that Jesus offers to us today is, if you want to be first, be last. Everybody wants to be first today. Maybe in studies, in profession, in technology, we want to be first. Jesus says, if you want to be first, be last. Being last is a painful thing. Being last, at times we feel difficult that others will not recognize our abilities or capacity to enhance life. But Jesus says, be last to be first. And the fourth wish list Jesus presents to us is, be a servant rather than expecting service from others. Serve to be served. Today, we all wish that others should be at our service. At every beck and call, people should come to our service. But Jesus gives, change your wish list. I'm sure when we serve the other, at times we experience suffering. But in the midst of this suffering, if we could serve others with love, with compassion, with care, with lots of abundance of grace and blessings from God, we can experience God's graciousness. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, today let's pray that this suffering is a way to understand God's will and accomplish God's will for us. Today let's pray that this suffering is a way to find solidarity with one another. Today let's pray that this suffering is a way to lift up the other. Let me conclude this reflection with two Bible quotes. We have it in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 22, verse 42. Father, take away the cup of suffering. Nevertheless, it's not my will, but your will be done. It was in the Garden of Gethsemane, Jesus offers himself to God. And the second quote from the Bible is from 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 8 to 10. Very beautifully, St. Paul says, we are hard pressed on every side, but not crushed. Persecuted, but not in despair. Struck, not destroyed. Because when we suffer, we carry around in our bodies the death of Jesus. And we reveal ourselves the life that Jesus lived. Today, let's remind ourselves. Whenever we suffer, even in the midst of suffering, if we could accomplish or do what is pleasing to God in His sight, God will give us the strength to overcome or endure the suffering that we face. Today, let's pray that in the midst of suffering, nothing can make us go away from God's love, because it can not crush us, it cannot destroy us, because we carry in our bodies the death of Jesus, and we reveal, when we suffer, the life of Jesus. Therefore, my dear brothers and sisters, we experience suffering, but let us understand and accept this suffering in a different way altogether. I'm sure God will grant us in abundance His grace and blessings when we suffer. For when we suffer, God's love of grace and blessing is in abundance. May God bless all of us in this endeavor.